Here to discuss that, Senator Durbin's decision not to run again, and much more from this week, host of the WGN Political Report, Paul
Another quiet week, I guess.
Yeah, nothing to talk about here.
Happy Friday, right? Let's start with that in Wisconsin, Paul, regarding the judge here. We'll see what the due process kind of suggests here as this plays out. But let me ask you, is the White House probably more interested in sending a message to judges throughout the country as it is the letter of the law here?
So the answer to that politically is going to be, I think so. I don't think this happened without the knowledge of the White House. But again, for people who are reacting to this saying, you know, she did this, here's the thing. There is a complaint against her, and if she did what the complaint says she did, she'll have some problems ahead of her. But that, as you said, that due process will play out. There'll be a hearing, there'll be trials, things will happen. We'll see how it comes out. And if it means whatever the penalties are, then she'll have to pay them. But as always, we're in a situation where due process keeps getting pushed aside. So let's just wait a bit and give her a chance to have a trial. To this point, she simply said what happened wasn't fair. But I don't think there's any question that it's a political move. And here's why. Not because of what she did or didn't do, was alleged of doing, but because right after that happened, you not only had a statement issued by Kash Patel, the head of the FBI, but you had the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, go on Fox and talk about how nobody is above the law, as she called her names, all that kind of stuff. I got to tell you, Attorney Generals do not go in public and talk about pending cases. They don't talk about defendants. They don't do that. And so because that happened so swiftly and so quickly, that would be the reason that I would look at this and say, clearly, this was intended to be political. Because, by the way, she's a judge. There would have been many other ways to handle this. A phone call, you need to report, we're going to be arresting you, please show up on your own. There's lots of other ways it could have been handled, given that she is certainly a legal professional. This was done clearly, arresting her outside, moving her to make I think, the public point that they're making. And listen, the last bastion of people that the administration hasn't gone after yet are judges, and indeed they have. She's not the only one, by the way. This isn't getting a lot of press yet, but in New Mexico, there's also a judge and he's a magistrate, and wife who were arrested with various allegations. But you're starting to see the arrests of judges to enter that world now.
Chipping away.
Yeah.
Let's pivot now and talk about Senator Dick Durbin, who announced he will not be seeking re-election to a sixth term. He obviously has served half of his life in Congress, and he is a leader in the Senate, #2 Democrat. Can you tell us what impact that'll have here on Illinois, losing that position of power?
That is a really important question, first of all. The notion that he's decided to retire, not terribly surprising at his age, the call for younger people, and all of that. But that having been said, the Senate is a very special club of 100. And so for people who think, oh, he had always made this decision, the truth is that if you talk to him about this, and I know he's talked to some reporters, I mean, leaving that group and giving up those relationships for decades, not an easy thing to do. So had he decided to run one more time, might not have been as surprising as you think. But he made the decision I think he thought was right to do, and certainly probably pressure from home as well and his wife. But that being said, Jenna, the point you raised is so important, which is we're losing, in Illinois, the #2 senator in the Senate. That brings clout. That's how we get the money for projects that we get. It's about the clout you have. That is critical in the world of the Senate. So whoever wins to replace him down the line, they don't get that same clout. In fact, Tammy Duckworth will become the senior senator from Illinois. And while she's respected and whatever, she doesn't have his clout and doesn't have that power that he had as the #2 Democrat in the Senate. And that's what we're losing.
Well, let's talk about the race to replace him. We saw the governor, J.B. Pritzker, endorse Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton. What impact, if any, could that have on anyone else who decides to enter the race? And there are probably many of them.
Well, probably significant, and that's one of the reasons it was done. Look, as soon as Durbin announced, within moments, you had a lot of course, accolades coming out, thanking him for his service, or whatever, Republicans going after him, everybody doing the partisan thing. But immediately, Raja Krishnamurthy, congressman, who most people would suggest he's been eyeing this, he announces a statewide tour on various issues. But Juliana Stratton came out, and she announced for this office. And moments later, Governor Pritzker, I endorse her. She also has a promise of a 7-figure investment from the Democratic Governors Association. And maybe JB has some money or not. I'm not sure. I think he does. The bottom line is it's not Juliana Stratton who's going to chase away candidates. It's J.B. Pritzker, our governor, and his resources that may chase away candidates. Now, that being said, Congressman Krishnamurthy has, as reported, $19 million in the bank, so he's ready for a fight. Congresswoman Lauren Underwood could enter this race. Supporters of hers have touted her success in the poll. I mean, not success, but her strength in polls, showing her that she's very popular. So lots yet to play out. I'm sure there will be a lot more candidates, but there's no question that those people who don't think they can raise a whole ton of money, Stratton, thanks to Pritzker, has probably knocked them out.
We'll see who the next name will be after that. Let's pivot to Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who we learned did another unsecured app talking about a military strike.
This one with his wife and his brother and his lawyer, personal lawyer.
Right. But at the same time this week, Trump supposedly is getting input from other people in the White House about Hegseth as the defense secretary. What does that signal to you? No pun intended.
Sure. Well, look, the bottom line is there are a lot of people who have now, left the Department of State who are, by the way, who were Hegseth supporters and his friends. And that's where some of this, what Hegseth is calling leaking. I don't know that it's leaking. It's more whistleblowing. They're reporting what it is they saw. And again, these were never Trumpers. These were people who actually supported Hegseth, but they saw what was going on, and it's not acceptable. The bottom line is you've only had one congressional representative with a military background who said, this guy's got to get fired. Most people will probably say in this situation, had it been anybody else, and certainly not with President Trump as president, he would be fired. The right answer is he probably should step down and or be fired. But as long as President Trump stands behind him, not a Republican's going to make a peep about it, and so he'll be safe as long as Trump wants him there.
Let's talk about economics and Fed Chair Jerome Powell.
Yeah.
The president wants him to lower interest rates. He had suggested he wanted him fired. Now he says he has no plans to fire him.
And that's because he saw what started happening to the markets. One day Trump says, I want him out. Like if he'd leave instantly if I said he was going, markets tank. What happens immediately? I'm not firing him. I'm not doing anything. I just think he needs to do something, which does show that President Trump, who sometimes says he's not watching the markets, he's watching the markets.
The other big sort of interesting tussle was between Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, and Elon Musk in the White House. More cracks are showing there. What do you make of that kind of high-profile exchange?
Well, when you take the fact that Musk, who initially, before Trump came into office, said we're going to take $2 trillion
from the
out
IRS?
of the budget. $2 trillion in general off the budget.
Right.
Then that got lowered to $1 trillion. And now we're seeing, what is it, about 150 billion or 800 billion? Somewhere it's a much smaller number in terms of what he's able to do. That's the way it goes. There's some, obviously, Musk has lost a lot of support, but he is rustling feathers. Bessent is certainly one of them. They're going back and forth. But here's the bottom line. Tesla is having struggles as well. And so Musk has said, in May, he did this on an investor call. In May, I'm going to return to Tesla. He pretty much has to, because at the end of May, that's what his position as this government designate has to go. And so if he stays on, he's got to disclose everything, all sorts of financial disclosures. He ain't doing that. So my guess is he will step down somewhere and may go back to the business, and whatever they've accomplished at that point will be what they've done.
Real quick, there's news today that the Trump administration wants to raise the threshold that states have to meet in disasters to receive FEMA money. What could be the impact on that? Obviously, red states, blue states, they all get hit with natural disasters and rely on the federal government.
And you know what? If you ask most people, they'd say, oh, he's going to take care of the red states. He's going to let the blue states suffer. And he is letting the blue states suffer, but he's letting the red states suffer. Of all states, we have Arkansas with Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the governor who worked with his press secretary. They couldn't be closer friends, and they've had this horrible storm, and he has said no and denied the recovery there. North Carolina, he's saying no to. There are red states out there. He's saying no. He's looking to save money, and he's hitting both red and blue.
And the states won't be able to cover costs.
They can't.
Okay.
There's no way.
What's on the show this weekend?
So on this Sunday, we're going to have Rick Pearson, our good friend Rick Pearson from the Tribune. He's going to come on and talk about this whole Durbin situation as a reporter on the inside, telling us what's going on. And I'll be joined by the Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul on the 12 states attorney generals who have gotten together to challenge the tariff issues. Also, what Illinois is doing about the federal funding that's getting cut, because he would be at the legal head of all of that. And maybe I'll just ask him whether he's going to run for Senate, because why not?
Why not?
Why not?
Sunday,
Everybody
9 a.m.
else is.
Thanks, Paul.
Sunday at 9.
Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
guys.